Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Everett, and along with my wife, Michelle Everett, welcome to day 22 of our study, Christ, the Living Expression, as recorded in the Gospel of St. Luke. Well, we're getting close to that moment now of where we have been leading up to the whole time from chapter 1 up to this moment. In chapter 22, some very pivotal and important things are going to take place. So let's get into the story itself. So that's the celebration of the Passover lamb. Now I want to take a moment to bring you back to something that happened at the birth of Jesus. The shepherds would take young tender lambs and place them in swaddling clothes, cloths, and they would put them actually in those feeding troughs because it was important that there would be no blemish on the lamb at all if they were going to sacrifice them at Passover. They couldn't have any scars, any blemishes, or any of those things. And now it's Passover time. The Lamb of God, who's unscarred, no blemishes. As the book of Hebrews says, he was without sin. He was perfect. He was harmless, separate from sinners. Now, he's about to live what he came to earth for. And so what the religious leaders and scholars of law are continuing to do is scheme and find a way to murder Jesus without starting a riot. And the reason being is because they feared the people. Now, you know that the scripture tells us that the fear of man brings a snare. So they're going to end up ensnared anyway. So at that time, Satan enters into the heart of Judas Iscariot, and he places it in his heart to go to the hierarchy, the Jewish hierarchy, and to betray Jesus to them. And they agreed to give him a sum of money, 30, if you will, silver coins. Judas vowed that he would find a way that's suitable. And, and it would be where the people weren't around, the crowd weren't around, and he would betray Jesus to them. Well, Jesus at this time now, in preparation for the Last Supper, he sends Peter and John, and he instructed them, go and prepare the Passover supper so that we can eat it together. And he told them exactly where to go. He said, when you enter the city, you'll find a man carrying a jug of water. I mean, look at how precise the details are and what's necessary in order that they find the right person. He said, follow him home and say to the owner of the house, the teacher told us to ask you, where is the room that I may use to have the Passover meal with my disciples? He will then take you to a large, fully furnished upstairs room. Now remember, equally we said something about the upstairs. That's where you receive family members upstairs. He said, make the preparations for us there. They went and found exactly everything that Jesus had prophesied, and they prepared the Passover meal. So from there, Jesus and his disciples, they shared the Passover meal. And in the midst, while the meal was going on, it wasn't right up front, he raised up the cup, and it was the cup of wine. And he said, take this, pass it around one to another. See, it was only one cup. Now, I know today we have reasons for it, but we give small cups when we're sharing the communion together. Well, it was one cup then because the cup there, the wine, represented the one who was about to give his life. And he told them, drink this wine because what it represents is speaking prophetically that we will be together in the feast of God's kingdom realm. And we won't share this again until we're together. It was the cup of the New Testament. See, he's prophesying again. Yes, we're ending an Old Testament. We're entering a new. And every time that God establishes covenant is through the means of blood. Because without the shedding of blood, there can be no remission of sin, and there can be no establishment of covenant. Later, he lifted up the bread and praying a prayer of thanksgiving to God. That is, he blessed it, then he brake it, and then he gave it to each of the disciples. See, that is exactly what God does with the life. He'll receive us, he'll bless us, then he breaks us by dealing with our lives, and then he distributes us to be the bread of life to people. And Jesus said, "This loaf is my body, which is now being offered for you. Always eat it in remembrance of me." You do this in remembrance of me. And finally, before they ended the meal, he lifted the cup one more time. And he said, "This cup is the cup of the new covenant. Always remember that. And I will make with you, and it will be poured out soon for all of you." Now, I'm not sure if they were really catching everything that he was saying to them. But all of these words were in preparation, because he said, after the meal was over, the Son of Man must now go where he will be sacrificed. So we're looking now. It's close. It's really close. But there will be great and unending doom for the man who betrays him. And he knew that it was Judas. You see, in the story, the one that he gave the sop to, that's the one who was actually the honored guest, considered the honored guest. Can you imagine this? Jesus, knowing that Judas was about to betray him, and he didn't treat him as a betrayer, he treated him as the honored guest. And after that, he said, "Go ahead and do quickly what you must do." The apostles, at that time, not really having a clue, questioned among themselves which one of them was about to do this. Now, you know what I really believe? If they all had known that it was Judas, they would have tried to stop him. And the reason that I know this is true is because as we go into the story, you'll find that when they came to apprehend Jesus, they thought that they should take their swords, their knives, and stop them. And I'm sure if they could have gotten to Judas, it would not have been well for Judas that day. But before that happens, they start to argue over, okay, since he's saying he's going to leave us, well, which one of us is going to be the greatest among us? Because there's something about man's head that seeks for the top. And what they don't realize is that if you're at the top and you're not spiritual, but you're basically carnal, then you're really going to actually be someone that just overpowers people. Your rule is going to be a rule of tyranny. But Jesus said, this is who is at the top. It's actually the one at the bottom. It's the one who chooses to be servant to the rest. That's the one who really qualifies to be the greatest. And later, when he establishes even the ministry, he calls them foundation. Foundation is not the roof. It's at the bottom of the house. It's holding up the whole house. And he's telling them, greatness is when you're at the bottom and you're the support structure for everything that is standing on you. And so, of course, I'm sure that they had to probably ponder on that a little bit as well. Now he talks directly to Peter. He said, listen, Peter, Satan is going to sift you. He has, in fact, desired you. He's demanded you. And he's going to sift you as wheat. My friend, this is important, what he said, as wheat. Because whatever wheat is properly sifted, it settles. Whatever the chaff is sifted, it flies away. The wind catches it and takes it away. But the wheat settles to the foundation. He was really telling Peter, you're about to get settled in a way that you have never been settled before. In fact, Peter later writes about this. He says, we're strengthened and settled and grounded when we go through suffering. Now, Peter was about to go through suffering because Jesus said, you are going to deny me thrice. And Peter thought beforehand, he said, oh no, I'll never deny you. In fact, why don't we go up to Jerusalem and if you're going to be in prison, we'll be in prison with you. If you're going to die, we'll die with you. It's what I call sometimes writing a check that you're unable to cash. Peter wasn't ready yet for that. And he had to go through this experience in order to be the leader that Jesus had destined him to be. And he said, before the cock crows thrice, 3 times. And as you study each of the volumes of the gospel, you'll find out the cock crowing was the change of the watch. And it would change 3 times before daybreak. He said, you're going to deny me thrice. And so they come into the garden because they leave from there and go to the garden where Jesus would often go and pray. And when he was done praying, and of course, this prayer was important, he told them, watch with me. Watch and pray that you enter not into temptation. Because the temptation that he's talking about here is going to be to try to change the will of God to make it conform to what they think that is supposed to be. He says, so you need to pray. So he prayed. And then they're sleeping for sorrow. I mean, the weight of this moment is on them. Now, you're speaking of weightiness. It was so intense on Jesus as a man that even his sweat turned into drops of blood. He was already sacrificing at that moment. And he said, Father, if it is any way to do this differently than what the plan calls for, let's do it. But nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And he said this. He said this more than once. Because everything that the story was hanging on was this moment of him totally relinquishing his will and not reneging. Now, everything, every line of the story, every bit of the plot had unfolded perfectly to this moment. But now Christ, the living expression, must walk through this moment. And it was prayer that got him through. So when they came to receive him, when they came, he didn't resist. He didn't back up. All he said was, the Prince of Darkness has now come. And once again, he gave this warning about the one that betrayed him. He said, woe to that one. Well, Peter follows after the guards from the temple had apprehended Jesus, and they're now taking him in. And Peter follows from a distance at first, and then he gets close. And 3 times, someone says, You're one of his. I know it. Your language, you're Galilean. It betrays you. And Peter denied vehemently, I don't even know the man. And finally, the third time, when he said it, Jesus just looked at him. And when he looked, I'm sure Peter was saying, oh my God, he told me this was going to happen. And he went away and cried bitterly. And then they mocked Jesus. They beat him. They challenged him as a prophet. They blindfolded him. They said, tell us, prophet, who's beating you? Tell us, who's smacking you? He answered not a word. And then they brought him before the Jewish council. And they said, tell us, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God or not? He said, you've said it. You've declared it. And then they all shouted, we've heard it from his very lips. What further proof do we need? And what they don't know, they were playing right into the hands of the wisdom of God. Now, Christ, the living expression, it has come to the final point where he's going to release his life. And oh, what joy. It tells us that the Christmas story was not in vain, and what he was sent to do, it is now being completed. And what appears to be one of the darkest moments in human history, we can actually see the radiant glow of heaven shining on earth, and the announcement that peace had come. Oh yes, it may have come through death and crucifixion, but peace, unprecedented peace, like the peace that Solomon in his reign started with, even greater, is now being released in the earth. So join us as we look at the 23rd chapter of Luke our next time together.